What's up guys, Reese here from Stoic Pool, and sorry, I know I said stop introducing myself, but anyway, I have, so there we go. In this video, we're going to be building a helper function module for our tests. Let's get into it. So, first up, we got our test for our market buy, but we need to write a test for our market edit and our market delist. Now, right now, we're just going to leave these as true, and we're going to start building our helper function module. So we're going to basically reduce this output into a little helper function. And so we'll go into our lib folder in course, and we'll make a new file, and we'll call that tests.ak. And in here, we're going to write a pub, use the pub keyword to make it public, and we're going to say a function called input, and that's going to return an input. And then we'll say let input equal an input type with an output reference of oref and an output of output. And then we'll just return the input. Okay, and now we can put those arguments in. So we'll put our oref as an output reference and our output as an output. That's basically it for that helper function. When we use this, we're going to make sure that we supply an output reference and an output into that function, and we're good to go. Next up, we're going to write our output reference. So we're going to say pub function oref. And in here, we're going to put an ID because an output reference has a transaction ID and it has an output index. So we're going to put an ID of a byte array and an index of int, and that's going to return an output reference. And just like before, we're going to put oref equal output reference with a transaction ID of ID and an output index of index, and we'll return the oref. You can kind of see how this is going. It's really easy to write these kinds of helper functions, and they're definitely worth doing because when we start changing this round, you're going to see how much easier it is to write these things. We could make things a lot more granular, so we could have like a market input specifically, and we could have that market hash from our validator input automatically, but we don't need to do that. We can specify them for each test anyway, and generally more general purpose helper functions are a bit more useful. But when you're doing things like, when you're working on dApps, often you'll do things like a helper function for the market datum, for example, and you'll just use that to input the two elements in our market datum, and that'll make it easier. But for now, we don't really need to do that, so we won't. The next one is our output. So we're going to say pub function output, and that will obviously return an output, and then we're going to put an address, a value, and a datum. There's one element missing from this, which is our reference script, but we're not going to be using our reference script. We're just going to have it as none all the time. So instead of having that as an extra argument to our function, we're just going to forget about it and always have that return none. So we'll say let output equal an output type with an address of address and a value and a datum and a reference script of none. And you'll see that I've just written the value and the datum in, and that's because the output type is already defined, so we know what each of those fields should be, and so we don't need to explicitly write address is address and value is value and datum is datum every time. We can just put those variables in from the arguments, and that Aiken knows what those things are because we know what the type is. So I'll just do it here as a demo, so you can see it, but generally speaking, when I do this kind of stuff, we will input the types in, or we'll name the fields specifically, because it will just help you guys learn. But seeing as we've named them the same thing and we know what they are, like, we'll just do it like this. So then we obviously need to return that output, and we're done with output. Now there's a couple of other things that would be quite helpful, because I've already made mistakes with it in the last video. And that's specifying a wallet address and specifying a script address. And doing this will just make it a lot easier for you to put these things in. And it'll make it easier to read when you're reviewing your tests as well. So we're going to make an address with a payment credential of a verification key and an address with a payment credential of a script. We're going to write a public function called script address, and that's going to return an address. And then we'll say let address equal an address type with a payment credential of a script and hash. And hash is going to be a byte array that we add as an argument to our script address. And just like with our output, where we're not going to include our reference script, we're going to do the same with the state credential here because we're not using them right now. So for the sake of just making it easier, we're going to ignore it, and we're just going to put none and then return the address. Now for our wallet address, it's exactly the same as this, except instead of a script hash, we're going to have a verification key hash. So I'm just going to copy this, we're going to change it to a wallet address, we're going to change the payment credential to a verification key, and then we're done. All right, so there's one other helper function that I'm going to write, and it's kind of pointless to an extent, but I'm going to do it anyway because otherwise it just makes writing easier, essentially. So we're going to do an asset helper function too. Now we could write assets.fromAsset and input the fields all the time, but when we can just write assets in our function, it does make it a little bit easier. So just for the sake of doing it, I'm going to do it. So we're going to write a pub function called asset. We're going to return a value, and we're going to put a policy ID, an asset name, and an integer. And we're actually going to change that to quantity. And we're actually going to call this make asset as well. And then we'll say let asset equal assets.fromAsset, policy ID, asset name, and quantity, and return the asset. So you can see how kind of pointless it is, and well, it's not pointless. It's also not unnecessary. It just makes writing these things a lot faster, especially when you're writing your tests, because writing assets.fromAsset all the time, it just like these kinds of things just slow the process down, and we want to make it as quick and easy to throw these tests together as possible. And seeing as we're going to be importing this module anyway, and we're going to have like t.input, I'll get to the t bit in a second, but t.input with a t.oref and t.output and t.wallet address and t.make asset, it will just make it easier to write. All right, so yes, it's kind of unnecessary, but I'm going to be doing it anyway. All right, so now we've got this little helper function module together. We're going to refactor our market buy just to incorporate these functions. So the first thing we're going to do is use course/tests, and we're going to import it as t. And now we can change our assets.fromAsset to t.makeAsset. And then we're going to do our oref. So we're going to change our letOref to be t.oref with cafe and 1. And then we're going to start working on our inputs. So we'll start with market input. We'll say t.input, oref, and t.output, because it's our output reference and the output for that input. And then we can say t.script address is def, and market value and inline datum of market datum. And we don't need to have the reference script none because that's already handled by a helper function, so that saves a little bit of time. And it also saves me making that mistake. And then we can get rid of that input. So next up is buyer in, so t.input, t.oref of cc and 2. Because in the previous video, I just used the oref as the same, but in reality, they would be different because you can't have duplicate output references. So we'll change that to cc and 2. And then our t.output is going to have a t.wallet address of buyer and assets from Lovelace of 200 and no datum. And then we can delete that input. Next up, we got our buyer out. So we'll have t.output, t.wallet address of buyer, market value, and no datum. And then we can get rid of that output. And for seller out, we can do the same, where we just copy the t.output from before, and we can change that wallet address to seller. And also put that equal sign back in because I forgot it. Okay, so now we've basically refactored, so we can run our test again. And you can see that tests, our test helper function library is saying output reference is an unknown type. And that's because obviously I forgot to import all of the all the modules. So classic Reese. So we're going to nip round to our test library and we're going to import our missing variables. So input, output reference, datum, no datum. We're going to import address with our address, script and verification key, and assets. And actually we need to import value explicitly from assets as well because we use that type. And then when we run our test, we can see we do 3 checks. We got 0 errors, which is a good thing. And we have 7 warnings. And the reason we have these warnings is because in our marketplace test, we're still importing things that we're not using. So because now they're being imported and used in our helper function library instead of our validator tests. So we can go through and delete all these things. And once we've removed them all, or most of them. We can run our checks, and you see we got one warning of no datum, but I'm just going to ignore that for now. You can see here that we have our 3 tests working, and market edit and market delist, they're the same. Because we're not actually running tests, we're just returning true at the minute, if you remember. So now we're able to actually write those tests. And you can also see that market buy has increased slightly in memory and CPU usage. So execution units across the board have increased. But that's because we're just importing these values now in the form of our helper function library. So that's why it's costing a little bit more. But in reality, this isn't actually going to affect your validators. So I wouldn't worry about it too much because the validators are compiled. So all the calculations are already compiled. So it doesn't matter that we're importing things once the validator is compiled. So it shouldn't really affect the cost of running the validators on chain, but that's just a little explainer as to why they've increased. Cool, so that's it for this video, guys. In the next one, we're going to be building the 2 other tests that we need for market edit and market delist. I'll see you then.